We're in chapter 18, where Jesus is about to be arrested. He had finished, you remember chapter 14, 15, and 16, he had talked to his apostles about him going away and about the Holy Spirit or the Spirit of truth coming back and teaching them in all truth. And now in chapter 17, he prays back to the Father. He prays for himself, and then he prays for his apostles or his followers that God had given him, and then he prays for everybody that would believe on them through their teaching, that they all may be one as he and the Father are one. Then after he finished this prayer, we see then in chapter 18, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Cedron, which was a garden, into the which he entered, and his disciples. And so it was custom. This is what Jesus was doing all week. He would go from there. He would go through this Garden of Gethsemane. It was on the way to Bethany, and he was going to Bethany, and he would stay with Lazarus and Martha and Mary. And so Judas knew this. Judas knew which way he went. Judas, by the way, had already gone to the chief priests and had bargained with them to sell Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And they also, I think it's interesting in that, they made another statement from Judas from the book of Luke. They said, make sure there's not a multitude of people around or a bunch of people around, because the people knew that Jesus was teaching the truth. And, you know, many times it said they wanted to take him, but they couldn't take him because of the people. And so because they would cause a big problem and get in trouble with the Romans. And so they made a deal with Judas. You make sure that when you betray him where there's not a lot of people around. And so Judas knew that Jesus would come to this through this garden. And so he knew about what time it would be there. And so Judas, he was prepared then to bring the mob and arrest Jesus. Now, we talked last week about how that John doesn't record how Jesus first went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he goes out and he prays. He takes Peter, James, and John with him. He goes a certain distance. And then the book of Luke says he goes from them a stone's throw away from them, and there he prays by himself. And each time, 3 times he'd come back, and each time he'd come back, the apostles or disciples would be asleep. And he said, couldn't you wait? Couldn't you stay awake? And so the 3rd time when he come back, he woke them up. He said, the hour's here, and we see that Judas then comes in. Well, here John doesn't record any of that, and so we've got Judas there in verse 2, and Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oftentimes resorted thither with his disciples. And so Judas knew where he was going, and so Judas knew this place, and he come. So look, then Judas, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, come hither with lanterns and torches and weapons. And so Judas brought them to them. Now, I know the other gospel says, and John doesn't record this, how did Judas betray Jesus? With a kiss. Remember, he goes up, and that's how he identifies him. But John doesn't record that. He just says that Judas came. And so when he did, then they asked this question. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, who seek ye? Now notice that Jesus, how would you feel if a mob of people was coming to get you, and would you stand up and say, hey, here I am? That's essentially what Jesus said, you know. So he asked, who seek you? And they answered, Jesus of Nazareth. And notice he said unto them, Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. And as soon as he said unto them, I am he, they went backwards and fell to the ground. Now, I don't know why that they fell to the ground. I don't know if it was the voice of Jesus that you remember now when the officers come to get him. They said, no man ever spake like this. I don't know if it was the way he was or the bravery of Jesus saying, when they come to get him, I'm he, here I am, I don't know why, but evidently they were startled and they all fell to the ground. And then they asked him again, whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said, I told you that I am he. If you therefore seek me, let these go their way. In other words, let the disciples go and you can take me. I'm here. I'm not trying to flee or anything. He knew that his hour had come. He knew it was time for him to die. You remember all the other times when they tried to take him, the Bible says he went through the midst of the crowd, or he walked away from them, or he was able to get away from them. I'm sure these were probably miraculous things that he did because he says, my hour's not yet come. But now the hour has come when he has to die. And so he is telling them, let these go, let these others go, and you want me, and I'm here. And so, notice that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake, of them which thou gavest me, have I lost none. Again, the apostles fled. But now notice then, Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, I think it's interesting when you study this. You have to study like all 4 of the Gospels to get the full story on this. Peter cut off his right ear. The book of Matthew and the book of Mark tells us that Peter did this. Luke tells us that Jesus touched his ear and healed it. And then John tells us what the man's name is. The man's name is Malchus. And so when you put them all together, you get the complete story. He was a servant of the high priest. And probably a little bit later, we're going to see that John was a friend of the high priest. And so probably John knew his name by being associated with the high priest, because he was a kinsman of the high priest. And so here's this man coming and going to take Jesus. Peter jumps up and cuts his right ear off. His name is Malchus, and Jesus performs a miracle and heals the man right there in front of them. And so Jesus said to Peter, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which thy Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? And notice then, the band and the captain and the officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. Now, really, there wasn't no need to bind Jesus. He wasn't trying to escape. He said, when they come to get him, here I am. If you want me, I'm here. And so there was no reason for them to bind him. And now it says the band. I don't know for sure how many people came to get him. In the some were Romans and some were Jews, and so a band of Romans would be 600 people. Now I'm sure there wasn't that many people here, but they were probably just a small group of the Romans that came with the Jews in order to arrest him. And so they took Jesus. They led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that year. Now this Annas was probably 60 or 70 years old. He was an older gentleman, and he had been high priest. And I was reading in one of the commentaries, it said that he had 4 or 5 sons that had served as high priest, and now he has his son-in-law serving as high priest, sort of like a monopoly on this thing. but he was older, and they wanted to, because he was at one time the high priest, they wanted to take Jesus first to him. And so they take him then and led him away to Annas first. Now, notice it talks about Caiaphas. John puts a quote in here. Remember from chapter 11, Caiaphas, it was he that gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Remember we read from chapter 11 how that Caiaphas had made this prophecy that one would die for the people. And so John just puts a sort of a side note in there talking about which Caiaphas he's talking about. So Simon Peter then followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now it seems like we read from the book of Mark that when this happened, when they came to get Jesus, the book of Mark said they all fled. Now it seems like probably Peter and John at that night fled, and then they came back. Peter and John at least came back and were at a distance from where Jesus was. And so Peter knew the high priest, John did, notice, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And it doesn't mention John, but all scholars conclude that this was John. And so did another disciple, and that disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. So John was evidently known by this high priest, and most scholars think that's why he knew who Malchus was, because he's a kinsman of the high priest. And so John was able to get into the palace. And now notice, Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, or John, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. And so John knew this high priest, and so he goes to the lady that's the doorkeeper there, and talks to her, and she lets Peter in. But notice this is Peter's first denial. Then said the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? And he said, I am not. And so the woman was the first one to identify him. Now notice then, the servants and the officers stood there, who made a fire of coal, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. And so Jesus then is before the high priest. Peter is standing outside, warming himself by the fire. Now remember, this is all taking place at night. Jesus in the morning is going to be crucified. Now, when it talked about just a little bit later, we get down there, the cock crowing, the rooster crowing. Most people think that was like 3 o'clock in the morning. When one of the Gospels says that before the cock crows twice, thou deny me thrice. Well, they say that the rooster crowing is like at midnight and usually at 3 o'clock. Now, I tell you, those roosters are pretty well on time. I know this because we went to Costa Rica one year, and we were in this little old hotel that the windows were like paper almost. You could hear everything outside. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, that rooster would start crowing. And it would wake you up, and I could lay there and count like to 9, and it would crow again. It was right on time every day, and it woke us up every day. Tim was hollering, "I'm going to kill that rooster," and anyway, those animals they're on time. They know what they're doing, and so some have suggested that this rooster crowed at midnight, and then again at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so But the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. And notice how Jesus answered him. I spake openly to the world. I even taught in the synagogue, in the temple, where the Jews also resorted, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. Jesus is saying, I didn't say anything. I didn't try to hide, I didn't go, it wasn't a conspiracy where I would talk to them or anything. I was very open with them. I talked to them. I spoke in their synagogues. I spoke in the temple where the Jews were. I spoke openly, and just ask them what I said. And notice then, because of this, when he had spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answer thou the high priest so. And so, for no reason at all, they smote Jesus, because all he said was, just ask those that I've talked to, what I said. And so he was struck then for no reason at all. By the way, I'll give you a little bit of a quiz here. Who else was struck in the mouth because when they were talking to the high priest? Paul was. And Paul said he didn't know when they struck him in the mouth. He didn't realize that was the high priest. He wasn't, even in times when they were in courts and things, they respected the authority of the courts, of those who were asking them questions. And so Jesus then, because this was struck, Jesus answered and said, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But it's well, why smitest thou me? In other words, if I have said something that's wrong, then go ahead, you deserve to hit me. But if I haven't said anything wrong, why do you smite me? And then, so Annas had seen him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. So again, here he is. He's before Annas, and he is smitten in the face. And then Annas finally sends him to Caiaphas. Now notice again, here's Peter. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Art thou also one of the disciples? He denied it and said, I'm not. And so again, he was out there where they had the fire, and he was warming himself, and somebody asked him, aren't you one of those disciples? Now, in one of the Gospels, it says, you're one of the disciples because you're a Galilean. They could tell by the way he spoke where he was from. And so, John doesn't record that. But anyway, then again, one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did I not see thee in the garden with him? And so this is a servant of this high priest that of Malchus. And so Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. And so remember, Jesus had told Peter, before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And certainly this came true. Now, it seems like Peter might have lost his nerve. At first, he was ready to defend Jesus. You remember, he cut the servant's ear off. And Jesus says, put that up. That wasn't the reason why I've come for another reason. And now Peter had no defense as far as that was concerned. And so he was afraid that he would be convicted too or be persecuted. And so he denies the Lord these 3 times. And so now we read in one of the other Gospels that what happened when he denied him a 3rd time? Yeah, Jesus, he made contact with Jesus with his eyes, and he wept because of that. And so, notice then, they led Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and most people think it was very early in the morning. And they went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they could eat the Passover. Now, this hall of judgment was the Romans' hall, and the Jews didn't want to go in there unless they would touch something. You remember they had come early from the last chapter, the last part of chapter 11, said the Jews went up to Jerusalem early to purify themselves for the Passover. And so now here they are, and they are at the judgment hall, and they won't go through the judgment hall because they might defile themselves before they partake of the Passover. But I want you to notice how hypocritical these Jews are. Here's some things that I wrote down from a book that somebody wrote of what they did wrong to Jesus that night. Number one, they arrested him at night, and that wasn't something that the Jews practiced. Number two, they bound him as a malefactor or as a criminal. You remember when they took him, it said they bound him. Number three, they struck him in open court during his trial. That was a defilement of what they would do. Number four, they tried him on a feast day. That wasn't something that the Jews practiced. Number five, they tried him before sunrise. Number six, they compelled him to criminate himself. And number seven, he was sentenced on the same day of his conviction. Now, here's 7 things that they had done wrong concerning Jesus. But yet, well, we're not going to go through there because, we might defile ourselves and we can't take of the Passover.
Well, Jimmy, I think that kind of shows how scared they were of him, that they knew they were doing wrong.
Yes. And, for the fact that they would get with Judas and say, make sure that you get him where there's a small crowd, not a lot of people. They knew they were wrong, yes. But can you think of the hypocrisy that, I thought of this, it's almost like somebody that would beat up his neighbor and whip his wife or something, and do some bad, steal something from work, and do things all during the week, and then say, I can't wait to get to church Sunday morning to partake of the Lord's Supper. That's just about how this looks. They done everything they could that was wrong, and yet they said, well, we better not go through this judgment hall because, we might touch something that the Gentiles have touched, and that would defile us, and we couldn't partake of the Passover feast. How hypocritical can you be? And so that's how they felt. And so they would not go. Now, we see then that Pilate, evidently, this is early in the morning, then went unto them and said, what accusation bring you against this man? Now, Pilate had been told earlier when he was talking in the other Gospels, don't have anything to do with this just man. His wife told him, don't have anything to do with this just man. And we know that from the other Gospels, Pilate actually took a bowl of water and washed his hands and said, I'm free from the blood of this man, Pilate really, when you get down to it, Pilate he became scared because of this. If you look at chapter 19, in verse 7 and 8, then the Jews answer him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Notice this. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was the more afraid. I mean, he really didn't. Pilate was caught in a bad situation, but he should have been able to be a man and do what was right. But instead, he gave in, just like all politicians do, he gave in to the pressure of the people.
His wife also helped in his fear, Pilate's wife.
Oh, sure. I'm sure he thought of that when she said, yeah, don't have it. You know, he said, I don't know how many times, I know in John it says 2, but I know in the other Gospels, several times he says, I find no fault in this man. You know, he would go question Jesus and come back and tell the Jews, I find no fault in him. I mean, he knew they were delivering him because of envy and because of what they were trying to teach. Pilate knew that, and he didn't want to really get caught up in this. And so, as a matter of fact, I think when you read chapter 19, where Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and that's really a severe beating, and a lot of people die from this. I think he thought then, you know, if you see this bloody Savior like this, because they beat their backs, and they really, it's really, a lot of people, it's even known that people die from this scourging. It's a terrible thing to happen to anybody. And I think Pilate thought, if I do this, and he brought Jesus out, and they put a robe and a crown on him, and Pilate said, behold the man. You know, in other words, he thought maybe the Jews would be quiet about this. And then we'll read at the end of the chapter where it says that he said there's a man named Barabbas who was guilty of murder and in a robber and in the insurrection against the government. And the people says, release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. I mean, they were determined to do this. And so Pilate then came in and he said to them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it's not lawful for us to put any man to death. Now, I don't think we stop to realize Jesus had to die by the Roman authorities. He could not die by the Jewish authorities because Jesus had said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men to me, signifying by what death he would die. That is the death of crucifixion. And the Romans were the only ones that practiced this crucifixion. Had it been the Jews put him to death, how would they have killed him? They would have stoned him, just like they stoned Stephen. And so the Jews couldn't have put him to death because Jesus had already predicted that he would be crucified. And so
that's all true. But I think the reason that they're telling Pilate this is because under Roman law, they could not judge take a life. That under Roman law, it had been the Romans to do that. Yeah.
And it did. And, you know, they broke the Roman law when they stoned Stephen. I mean, they got away with it, but they broke it. They were so angry and so upset at Stephen, at his preaching, that they decided, hey, no matter what anybody says, we're going to do this. And they did that. But notice then,
In one of the
yes.
Gospels, don't they speak about that where he says, he hands him over to the Jews and say, you take care of him, and they push him back. They push him back to the Romans, say it's something about your law. Isn't there something in the Gospel, one of the Gospels, about that?
Jesus, in one of the Gospels, does turn him over to Herod. To Herod's judicial, and of course Herod is a Jew, and Herod then talks to him, but he sends him back to Pilate.
I thought there was one where one of them just turned him over to said, you judge him, or you take care of him to the Jews, and they turn him back. But I may be wrong about that, but yeah, I do remember that, what you're talking about.
Yes, he sent him to Herod one time, and Herod then questioned him and sent him back. And so Pilate said then, take him and judge him according to your law. The Jews said therefore unto him, it's not lawful for us to put any man to death. They didn't have that authority. They were under the Roman power, and the Romans were the only one that had the authority to execute the death sentence. And so then Pilate entered into the judgment hall. Notice, again, this is what I was saying, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. In other words, Jesus had already said that he was going to be crucified. And he had told his followers that several times. And so he tells them then what death he's going to die. And then Pilate entered in the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, art thou king of the Jews? And Jesus answered, sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it to thee? Did others tell it thee of me? And Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Now, Pilate was digging into this thing. You know, he knew for the sake of his own sake, the fact that he really didn't want anything to do with this. He wanted to try to get out of this as well as he could because of what his wife told him, and because several times he kept saying, I find no fault in this man. No fault of death at all in this man. And so he is trying to tell them that. But Pilate says, your own people have delivered you unto me. And Jesus answered and said, my kingdom, if not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. Now, Jesus is talking about his kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. It's not of this world. It's something from God. And so he is telling Pilate this. And Pilate said therefore unto him, art thou then a king? And Jesus answered, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone is of the truth, heareth my voice. And Jesus, of course, was born. You remember very early, the king was born in Bethlehem, and that's when Herod had sent people to try to destroy him, and had told the wise men, you know, let me know where he is, because he was so determined to destroy him that he destroyed all the male children 2 years and under in that area. And so Jesus was born a king. Somebody had Marcy.
I don't really understand what that says, if my kingdom were of this world, then my servants fight. What does that mean?
That means his kingdom is not a physical kingdom. That's really what it means.
If it was, there'd be war.
If it was, they would be fighting. They would be fighting war. His kingdom is not something that's of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom, and so his servants, there's no need of fighting any physical stuff.